know which way that goes.
Interesting comment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I'm going to bring Rushanara in next.
Great. Well, thank you. I've got some questions on fiscal consolidation, but just to take a step back, we've just talked about health and education, particularly health, where we know there are 7 million people on the waiting list, and 117,000 people are reported to have died waiting for treatment. And we also know about the long-term sickness issue and the way it's interacting with the economy. So can each of you just quickly talk us through whether the interventions, rather belatedly after considerable amounts of challenges for the NHS, these interventions with the slight increase in health spending, is it adequate in dealing with the kind of both the problem in itself but also the interaction between health and economics? I'm afraid you're going to have to be brief because I've got quite a few questions.
We didn't hear that in the autumn statement for sure. As I said earlier in my evidence, it was notable that the OBR pointed to that rise in the number of people on disability benefits, and I do think that the rise in people with health conditions, is beginning to is probably the most important drag on our aggregate labour supply.
So how much is the drag? What do you think is the percentage in terms of GDP that there could be a drag if we don't get a grip on the health waiting list of 7 million and those who are not in work who could come back to work if they were treated and not dying waiting for treatment, which is what I don't
have those figures, but those are exactly the kind of figures you would expect the Treasury, DWP, and the Department of Health to be working out together.
Does anyone else have a sense of what the drag would be?
Well, since February 2020, we've seen roughly a 400,000 rise in the number of people who are of working age but are economically inactive, and they say that they are so because of long-term sickness. And that's a 1.2% hit to the size of the workforce. So that's a sense of the order of magnitude. And I know others have looked at the sort of government's plans for waiting lists and whether they're adequate or not, and suggest that unfortunately waiting lists are likely to rise a lot further. Looking at some projections from the IFS earlier, that looks like those waiting lists will not top out until the end of next year. And looking at how that relationship between those waiting lists, which obviously apply to all adults, many of whom will be pensioners and out of the labour force, you could be looking at a 0.7% hit to the workforse from that further rise.
0.7% hit to with the workforce, and then in terms of output, what would that be?
Well, you could be looking at a similar size decline depending upon how productive those work as well.
Okay, 0.7%. Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. Did anyone else want to come in on that? If not, I'll move on. Okay, so my next question, it's linked to the kind of what you've talked about earlier about growth as well, and the connection between education, investment, and some of the points that have been discussed earlier. What is it? I suppose one of the questions is, it seems like from what we've heard, both from the Chancellor and today, the immediate challenges, the response, the autumn statements sort of has helped to allay some immediate issues, but when it comes to a growth plan, there isn't much of a growth strategy. There isn't enough in terms of what's in place to create the pathway out of this doom loop. So what do you think should have happened, needs to happen, building on what you've already said, and what sort of order of investment should we have had versus what we've had? Who will, perhaps Dr. You, if you want to kick off.
Firm surveys consistently show that the two biggest factors in boosting private sector investment, which is what you want to encourage, are certainty, so less uncertainty, and that's both at the regulatory tax regime. And the second most important factor, although increasingly it's become the most important factor, is actually skills. So skilled workforce, that takes time to develop. But you can have a very clear framework for a medium-term growth strategy that's consistent. So firms want to know if they place an investment in today, the framework, for instance, is set in legislation, so that if they invest in the green energy sector, it will be, it will give them that certainty over a medium-term horizon. So I think that would help. And the IMF has suggested that in times of high uncertainty, which is now, public sector investment can crowd in more private sector investment, especially in new areas like green technology like digital creates more jobs than traditional infrastructure. It gives a bigger boost to GDP. So I think those are the kinds of growth measures that would help. Again, centered on investment, but not to forget its people ultimately. Who
we've had 12 years of these sorts of demands being made, and there's been a lot of chopping and changing. So how quickly do these things need to be put in place in order to start to see the dividends, if you like, in growth happen? And when can we expect to have that happen if we put these measures in?
So the IMF estimate suggests you should be able to see that impact on GDP and employment in about 2 years.
Yep.
So obviously there's a longer term tail in terms of returns, but it is important, therefore, to try and incentivize that.
Yeah, and what do you see? If you were to put it in percentage terms, and what the autumn statements got? What sort of percentage mark would you give the current Chancellor in terms of what is put in place in order to generate growth, and what other percentage do you need him to do in order for us to see that happening within the 2 year to 5 year frame?
I was going to say something about
1%?
grade inflation, but
what grade would you give him, or what percentage? Because it's just useful for us to understand,
of course,
whether we've got enough in place to see a growth strategy and growth happening. Otherwise, we're going to be stuck in this position.
Yeah. So I think there's probably another component to generating investment and growth, which is maintaining the confidence of financial markets, which determine the cost of borrowing. I think that budget, the autumn statement did do that.
We've established that.
But the strategy part, I think that needs a lot more fleshing out in all the ways that we were saying before. Yeah. So there are bits of it which point to, for instance, maintaining the National Infrastructure Plan. Yep. For instance, the R&D tax credit, which we discussed, but a lot more needs to be there.
So, if you were to put a percentage on it, what has been done, and what else? Is it 20% on the way, 80% to go, or is it 50-50? Do you have a sense of what that looks like?
I guess if we did a traffic light system, I think on the cost of borrowing, that bit of it, it's green. I think if you were to look at a growth plan, we're probably, what's a mixture between red and yellow orange? We're probably kind of yellowish. We're not at the green, because obviously there's, as we've discussed, there's a lot of it had a very short period of time to put this particular autumn statement together, and I think he's only been Chancellor for a short period of time, but I would hope by the next budget next year there would be bringing together all the ways we've discussed, because fiscal policy can incentivize growth. So I think there's bits of it there, but it's not we're not quite at the green light.
Right. Okay. Just sort of finally for our colleague from the IFS in particular, and others actually, the head of the IFS said that we're expecting to see a huge amount of poverty in terms of the income slowdown in income growth. Poor income growth since 2008 is set to continue. Real household disposable income growth per capita is expected to be 32% lower in 2027 to 2028 than we might have expected in 2008. And then, of course, we've talked about the impact on different groups. Can each of you just talk us through what that means for our economy overall?
It's been an absolutely remarkable period. I mean, what
Paul was talking about was, if you just took a counterfactual world, which we might have thought was quite reasonable in 2007, that the kind of growth rates we've been used to for many decades just continue, and you compare that to what's actually happened, it does mean that we are, on average, much, much poorer than we would have been, something like 30% poorer. Clearly, the financial crisis, the overhang from that is a big part of that. There's been various shocks hitting the UK economy. The pandemic hasn't helped. Certainly the big increase in European gas prices hasn't helped. There's also been some policy mistakes in there too, which haven't helped as well. Some of the things.
He talks about own goals. What were they? We know about the external ones. Last week we heard evidence about the external shocks. Could you talk us through what the own goals are? And
so we've cut investment spending, now increased it back up again. So what matters for growth is how much capital you have in your economy. So clearly, and if we had a deficit problem, then cutting investment spending and increasing it again isn't going to help that. If you're worried about the deficit, you need sustained spending cuts or tax rises. So that's clearly an error. We still have failed to give, in particular, as I mentioned earlier, the roughly half of young people who don't go on to university a really clear route and a very high quality education and skills experience post 16. We've chosen as a country to go down a very hard form of Brexit, leaving the single market, which makes trade with our nearest and richest trading partner more difficult to do, which may have some benefits, but in terms of the economics, it makes us poorer. We've had lots of policy instability. So to give a recent example, the government said it was going to increase the corporation tax rate from 19% to 25%. Then it said it wasn't going to do it, and now it says it's going to do it. Now, you might have different views about what the corporation tax rate should be, but that kind of instability is not helpful for growth. So there's been various policy mistakes that have been made.
And what was the cost of the mini budget in terms of fiscal consolidation? Is it 30 billion?
I don't have a number for the cost of the mini budget. I think, thinking about what the legacy is, I think it's the fact that the Chancellor now had to focus very much on ensuring that the markets were content with the autumn statement. And I think so the cost is potentially one where, on the one hand, in the current environment, a Chancellor who's seen as credible might want to be very, very flexible and nimble, take a very long-run approach, versus to what extent did he feel he had to do stuff in the near term in order to reassure markets. I think that's the kind of cost.
So
it's pretty hard to put a number on that.
So we've had to have consolidation of 55 billion. So what amount of that do you think was he had to do in order to bring confidence to the market post mini budget?
I don't know.
A percentage, proportion?
I think it's really a very small proportion that you can directly attribute to the mini budgets and the blowout in gilt yields that we saw.
Sorry, say that again?
A very small proportion can be attributed to the gilt market disturbance that we saw in the wake of the mini budget. Because, of course, yields have already come down quite a lot considerably since then. They're now, if you look at the year-to-date increase for UK government bond yields relative to other countries, it's all now back in line. There doesn't seem to be much scarring in the gilt market there. But of course, we had to do this fiscal U-turn to get there. But I'd say the vast majority of that 55 billion long-term consolidation reflects the fact that we have much higher energy prices, reducing disposable incomes, and creating this fiscal gap. And
you're saying quite different things to what Carl Emerson was saying about the own goals. So
I think there have been many others.
It's both of these things, or I just want to be clear. You're saying one thing, focusing on one set of things, which are external. We know about the external shocks. Are you saying there are no internal own goals as described by Paul Johnson?
No, I think there have been, but I think most of the damage from the mini budget has been reversed by the subsequent actions, and they have become markets that.
Except market confidence.
Yes, that has been.
It's quite a big thing.
I think it's been largely restored if you look at gilt yields.
After the autumn statement and the Chancellor having to introduce introduce austerity 2.0, isn't that right?
But most of those measures would have been required.
Yeah, but no, they wouldn't have they weren't required in September.
I think they probably. I mean,
that's because we didn't have any OBR forecast at that point in which to ground policy. But once we'd seen the deterioration in the economic outlook, that has been largely caused by higher energy prices. And the fact that
we had that in September as well, before September.
But
the Ukrainian war started in February. Deterioration of oil prices has been happening for some months. Not since September.
The biggest rise in energy prices occurred in August. That's when we saw the biggest deterioration. And because of that, the OBR and they would have had to revise down its forecast for GDP considerably in September, just like they have done this time round. The vast bulk of the need for long-term fiscal consolidation comes from the fact that we have an assumption of higher energy prices, and also that the level of economic activity that is sustainable with keeping inflation under control is much lower than we thought. And there are other ways in which the government, I think, has not helped in that regard. That there's been a lot of scarring to the
So you
economy
think
from
we would have still
other
needed
factors.
it? We would still would have needed this, this statement then?
I think we could discuss this a lot longer, but unfortunately time is not on our